Hello and welcome everybody to another episode of r/ProRevenge. My name's Ryan, the official host here at Reddit Voice, and I look forward to bringing you guys today's top stories. Before I do though, I'd just really appreciate it if you could leave a like and hit that subscribe button and notification bell to stay up to date on all the latest videos. Mike finds a way to get rid of a problem employee. The revenge wasn't mine, but I figured I'd share as I was a witness to the beginning. Certain names and details have been changed to protect the guilty. Background: years I worked for a large bank in the UK. We all worked on the same floor and in the same department, but within different teams. I was just passing through on a secondment and saw the beginning of this revenge, but was filled in on the aftermath later. One of the teams was run by a woman called Sarah. Sarah was by many measures a good manager, but she had a blind spot. That blind spot was a woman called Helen. Now, when I was in my previous role, I interacted with Helen a fair bit, and she had seemed friendly, but when it came to actually working with her, she was a nightmare. She'd tattle, steal ideas and credit, and generally throw you under the bus at any opportunity. I'm not sure why Sarah always protected her, but it soon became a sore point for most people on the floor who had to deal with her. Enter Mike, who was the manager of a smaller team. Mike could be a bit of a dick, but was still professional and fun to work with. To give you an idea of his character, I found out I was being made redundant, and even though he wasn't my manager, he heard about it and booked time out to help me with my CV and do interview practice. Shortly after, it was announced that Mike's smaller team was being dissolved and the staff either made redundant or moved to other teams. At the time of the cuts, the economy in the UK was in a bad state, and all the banks were looking for efficiencies. He was redeployed and took the vacant manager role under Sarah that Helen had been gunning for. To make matters worse, Helen now reported directly to him. Helen was furious and spent no time in making her discontent known, as she felt she was entitled to the promotion. Unfortunately for her, Mike was wise to her. They'd both joined the company around the same time, and so he knew exactly what she was like. He'd even had her blame him for mistakes before. Even the projects that she had gotten so much praise for had been work one of his staff had done. So he started the process of documenting her poor work and attitude to manage her out of the business. Sarah, however, would not allow it. Helen was a high performer in her eyes, and she wouldn't sign off on him getting rid of her. When I left the team, Mike was frustrated with her and wasn't sure what to do. The revenge. I met up with Mike a year later, and he shared how he'd solved the Helen problem with me because he knew all of the issues I'd had with her. Because Sarah had his hands tied, his only other option to get Helen out of the team was for her to leave on her own accord. He couldn't just oust her by making her life difficult, or she'd go to Sarah. So he went the other way. Sat through every performance meeting with her for the rest of the year, gritting his teeth and praising her. That then justified him giving her a really high performance rating. He also used his own contacts to find roles in other teams at his grade that he then talked up to Helen. These roles were specifically selected because they specialized in one of the things Helen claimed she was an expert at, but had very little real experience in. Basically roles where he knew she'd have the highest chance of shitting the bed. Eventually, she applied for one, and he spent several weeks coaching her for the interview. In company at the time, the interviews were scored off of three main factors: performance rating in current role, competency-based interview results, relevant experience. He'd done everything he could to make her shine in all three. She took the promotion and within 2 months had quit the bank. He knew she wasn't ready for the responsibility, didn't have the skills, and her poor work ethic would be exposed. Worst case, she'd get her shit together and he'd still look like the perfect manager to Sarah. TLDR, upon finding out he couldn't fire the problem employee, manager gets her promoted to a team where she'll either get fired or quit. Stingy, narcissistic boss nags and skimps on employees, so I damage his ego with some sample tax. Let's call my whole boss Eugene, since his stinginess reminds me of Eugene Krabs from SpongeBob SquarePants, except Krabs is nowhere near malicious, and in order to display the full satisfaction of this revenge, I'll have to describe a few but not limited things Eugene did that entitles him to being a complete ass. For the context, Eugene owns a small company that provides artistic services of some sort and never hired full-timers. Which I learnt later that was due to his stinginess, and initially when I saw the open part-time position, I thought it was ideal for me as I had external commitments and needed some sort of income. The job offered around $550 USD per month. I don't live in the US and this is a rough conversion, but only required me to clock in about 90 hours a month. It wasn't a very good offer, but good enough for me as I considered myself to be inexperienced in the field. Note that Eugene had seen my portfolio and knew of my abilities before hiring me. The first couple of months were fine. I worked the hours I was supposed to and got paid accordingly, occasionally extending my shift at my own time due to the nature of the work, but I didn't mind. I guess Eugene saw this as an advantage he could exploit later on during my employment. It's also important to note that Eugene would often ask about my well-being, how did I spend my weekends, etc. At this point in time, it all seemed like courtesy talks, so I didn't pay much attention to it. He would ask about my previous employment and my reason for leaving, which I answered honestly that their work system was unsuitable for me. This would be important later. Eugene gradually began to grow more impatient towards me, often blaming me for not being able to match up to his ability. Remember when I was inexperienced, thus the pay rate? Eugene had over a decade of experience in this expertise, and he expected me to be at his level when I was only 3 months in. The stress was intense, and I began working longer hours just to keep up and produce the work at the best quality I could. I was under the belief that if I worked hard enough, my effort will speak. Even though this was only a part-time position, I overcommitted my time there and took pride in my work. My external commitments were barely scraping by. I was exhausted, but thought I was doing a good job until Eugene spoke to me one day. Eugene pulled me into his office and lectured me on my work etiquette, saying that I wasn't putting in enough effort and he was considering letting me go. At this point, I was beyond confused. Did he really not see the effort I was putting in? Was I delusional, thinking that I was actually doing well and my work had been improving? I tried speaking up, but he quickly diverted the topic, telling me he knew the reason why my previous employer hated me. It was because I was lazy and uncommitted. To say I was in disbelief was an understatement. Not only did I believe I did my best with every task handed to me, Eugene had registered my flaws during casual conversations and twisted my words to his advantage. I had no idea how to react and simply asked him what he expected of me. He instantly replied that he would like me to double my hours working for him at the same monthly pay rate. His reasons? It's my fault that I'm not experienced enough to produce quality work. Thus, it shouldn't be under my own responsibility and time to make up for it. My external commitments didn't matter. He said, as this job was my only source of income and should be kept as a priority. It finally dawned on me that Eugene was a narcissistic sociopath who only held conversations so that he could learn a person's weaknesses for his manipulation. Now, if you read my title, you'll see that Eugene was not only a narcissist, but also stingy. Eugene is obsessed with maximizing his profits. Any business owner loves that, I agree, but Eugene is down to every cent in an immoral and even possibly illegal way. He would sell a service to a client and upon receiving the deposit, deliver something else. He was smart enough to keep his contracts vague for both clients and employees so that nobody could take a legal action against him. More than often, his clients would be left to wit's end as it would be too late and expensive to engage in another vendor by the time they realized that they had been scammed. Eugene would then demand another set of payments to deliver what had originally been promised, overcharging the client an average of 100 to 200% more than what was agreed. Eventually realizing that they'd been played, most people would be too exhausted to pursue further action and prayed for the project to be over so they didn't have to deal with his antics anymore. This inaction probably fed Eugene's ego that he could get away with playing dirty every time. There are so many more things I'd like to rant about with Eugene, but this is the ProRevenge sub, not recruiting hell, so most of you would like to get to the good stuff soon. So in my country, employers are required to pay a certain amount of tax for every local employee that they hire. Well, it's not exactly tax, it's obligated by law, and negligence will result in a hefty fine and possibly jail time. These taxes are technically contributions for the employee's retirement funds, which is payable by every employer. Employers can deduct a certain percentage of the contributions from the employee's wages. This law has its own complications since there are a certain group of people exempted from it, such as students or interns. Now, Eugene is the classic example of a narcissist who thinks that he's smarter than everyone else. He felt that he was smart enough to evade the law by drafting a contract with vague details to protect himself, and was deluded enough to believe that everyone would believe him as long as he sounded convincing. In other words, he thought of people as sacks of potatoes with no opinion of their own. If anyone was to have a perspective, it had to be his way or the wrong way. I stayed in Eugene's company for about 4 months before I felt too mentally overwhelmed. On the day that I left, I called in to check my contribution account as, just as I had expected, Eugene hadn't paid a single cent over the past 4 months. The officer on the other end of the line asked if I would like to report this as a case. Guess my answer. A week later, I received an update from the contribution board saying that Eugene had disputed my case, claiming that I was only an intern and thus exempted from the law. This jerk was playing dirty as a last attempt to steal from me. As I had mentioned, Eugene thought of himself as a smart man and probably felt that the officer would rule the case in his favor since he had world-class convincing skills and his vague contract would have protected him either way. Fine, Eugene. So you think you can get away with just like any other time? You must have gotten pretty confident by now. Well, not this time. Eugene, I wrote a 2-page long email to the contribution board officer with every reason and evidence I can find on how I am not an intern, like Eugene claimed. Knowing his antics, I went the extra mile to research all of the exempted groups and wrote every possible reason on how I am not in the category. Excessive? Yes. Worth it? Hell yes. I didn't hear from the officer for 2 weeks, and when I finally did, he informed me that Eugene had agreed to pay my contributions. Remember when I said employers are permitted to deduct a certain percentage from employees' wages? Due to his negligence, Eugene could no longer do that and had to pay the full amount, on top of the fines that were incurred along with it. If he had dutifully abided by the law, it would have only cost him 1/3 of what he had to pay. So that's a bit of toll tax for you, Eugene. Now that I've gotten back what I was owed, I've decided to move on, but the story didn't end there. An ex-colleague of mine, NJ, who was still working for Eugene, told me that during the 2 weeks I didn't hear from the officer, Eugene was busy fighting for his stand by giving every reason that I'm an exempted individual. The officer, having seen my email, soon got tired of his nonsense and gave him a deadline to pay up or he'll be brought to court. NJ said he had never seen Eugene so defeated before. To top it off, it seemed like karma had finally caught up to him as he started losing more and more clients due to his unethical practices. The fine came to him, and when he had no clients that month, so it was a very obvious dent in his bank account. Ultimately, it wasn't a huge amount, but knowing Eugene's stinginess and ego, I think the damage was enough to qualify for this sub. Racist boss harassed Puerto Rican employees and broke labor laws. Ended up getting deported. I work at a fairly well-known restaurant in a small northern New England city as an assistant manager. The owners were very successful restaurateurs with several successful non-chain establishments, and spent maybe a day or two a month in our location. The rest of the time there was a general manager in charge. We'll call her Jan. Jan was about as type A as they come. She was a middle-aged woman, but beautiful and petite, and always looked put together and primped. Jan had started with the owners a decade earlier in their first restaurant as a server and had worked her way up to GM over the years. At first, I just thought she had extremely high standards, which I respected. I have high standards as well and take pride in my work. I had been impressed by how the kitchens were spotless. The staff was immaculate. Like run a white glove hand under the back of the oven and it comes back white kind of clean. The food was always top quality. I had frequently been a customer and was thrilled that I got the job there. I had been in the business for a decade and the restaurant was the place in our area. I was so excited. Unfortunately, I quickly learned why everything is so shining and perfect. Jan was a tyrant. She was the kind of boss who sourced the mood of the entire staff like a storm cloud hovering over us that never went away. Nothing was ever good enough and the standards changed from day to day. On a good day, she would shut herself up in the office and leave early. Good days were rare and could turn into bad days at the drop of a dime. On bad days, you couldn't be perfect enough, and she would come up with new rules and regulations just to punish people. If a host called out sick, they were literal children. She would berate them on top of the phone and make them cry. If a cook made a mistake on a plate, she would humiliate them in front of the staff, accuse them of doing it on purpose, and give us all the silent treatment for hours. Seriously. If someone's cash out was off, even by a few cents, she would accuse them of theft and force me to cut down their hours. As a fellow manager, I was mostly spared her awful behavior, though I had to hear about her treatment from my staff almost every day. All of this was just run-of-the-mill bad boss stuff until it came time for our yearly staff evaluation meetings. This is where Raul enters the story. Raul was a hard-working dishwasher who had moved to our state from Puerto Rico a few years earlier, and had spoke English with some difficulty. Whenever I had to go over anything official with him, we would have a coworker translate between us to be sure we were both communicating clearly. Jan refused this courtesy to Raul. This made his evaluation pretty difficult. Raul managed to communicate to us that due to recent cuts in his hours, he would be forced to get a second job to pay the bill. Something about this absolutely set Jan off. She told him that she would fire him if he dared. I could see plainly on the intake paperwork in front of me that Raul had been hired with the understanding that it would be a full-time position, so I pointed that out. Jan was furious, but agreed through gritted teeth that if Raul agreed to not get a second job, she would bump his hours up to at least 35 hours a week. It was stated as clear as day, and I documented it in my daily manager logbook. Work went on as usual after that, and I didn't see much of this meeting again for a few months. Another time, a while later, while filing out information for tax returns, Jan called me into the office. I could tell she had pulled the tiny room apart looking for something. All the information about our Puerto Rican employees is gone, she told me with a mixture of panic and suspicion. I looked at the files in question and they all seemed to be in order, so I was confused and told her that I couldn't help. A few minutes later, I walked into the back in the office to find her arguing with Rosa, our most talented chef and our Puerto Rican native. Rosa was perfectly fluent in English. No, Rosa. Jan was speaking to Rosa as though she was hard of hearing or mentally slow. Where is your green card? What are you talking about? Rosa was confused. Are you an illegal or something? Is that why one of you broke in here, to hide the proof? Jan wasn't yelling, but her eyes were cold and flashing with rage. What? Rosa was starting to get angry now. It suddenly clicked for me, so I interrupted. Jan, you do realize that Puerto Rico is a U.S. territory, right?
Of course I know that,
Jan snapped back. Okay, so you know that Rosa has a social security number like any other American native. Oh, right. Never mind, Rosa. You can go back to work. Jan did not apologize for accusing Rosa of theft. I was so done with this place after that. Jan did all kinds of little things like that, and she never apologized. I had already gotten a job offer from a place closer to my house, and when the final straw came. I was the closing manager one day, and got in just before the dinner rush to see Raul storming out the back door. He didn't speak much English, but his fucking bitch was very clear. Jan had lied about raising his hours to 35 per week, so Raul had gotten the second job he talked about. When Jan found out, she fired him, but not before saying something about how all you illegals are the same. She was really fixated on these American citizens being illegal aliens for some reason. By this point, I hated this woman. She once told me my clothing made me look poor in front of the whole staff. I was wearing what she made me wear. Meanwhile, she wore open-toed shoes behind the line, which is against health code, and once her fake nail fell off into the coleslaw and she wouldn't let anyone toss it out after she retrieved it. This is just the tip of the iceberg, but I have a life to live. Since I knew I would be leaving soon anyway, I told Raul he should go after our boss for wrongful termination since I had documented proof with Jan's signature that he had been promised more hours and that had Jan broken the agreement. Not Raul. The last time I saw Jan was on my way out of Raul's lawyer's office after giving a deposition about several labor laws she had violated. at least the ones I knew about. Apparently, there were many others she had broken in front of other employers. She couldn't even look me in the eye. The best part? At my deposition, I learned that Jan was actually the one who was illegally in the country. Her green card had recently expired. She was Canadian. She ended up being sent back to Canada as a result of the case, and no one's heard from her since. Raoul was granted 6 months of unemployment pay, plus the restaurant had to pay his legal fees. They closed that location not long after. Maybe they should hire their managers more carefully next time. Jan, if you're reading this, I hope you got your shit together. I also hope you learned to wear closed-toed shoes behind the line. You wouldn't want to end up with a huge, gigantic fuck due to your own negligence, now would ya? And with that, my friends, we've reached the end of today's video. If you liked it, be sure to leave a like and also subscribe so you can stay up to date with all the latest and greatest here on Reddit Voice. As always, my name's Ryan, the official host here at Reddit Voice, and I look forward to seeing you guys in the next video.